Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. And you can see the screen. All right, great. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you coming back and joining me today. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of nonprofit Utopia. And before we get started, I just wanted to share with you what we have here in our chat room. If you have not yet done so, please type your name, let us know where you're from. And I don't know if you had a chance to look at these links, but the first link here is a link to a theory of change flowchart. This is from our first webinar where we focused on a theory of change. And as you may or may not have noticed, we have a series of 3 workshops and webinars that will build one upon the other. The first is the theory of change, and then we're going to build upon what we learned in the theory of change to focus on building out the logic model. So here is a simple logic model worksheet, and then here is a link to a worksheet that has a logic model, but it also includes information on how to incorporate your evaluation planning process. That's very, very important. So all too often we may start our programs but not necessarily do the upfront planning that we need for evaluation. So our approach today is going to focus on developing logic models in such a way that you can use them for 3 phases of your process. And we'll go into that in more detail. And here is a sample logic model for the Second Chance Act. I noticed some of you are actually working very closely with ex-offenders and you're very familiar with the Second Chance Act. So I thought it might be appropriate to share an example from the Second Chance Act. And then also, more and more you have to do collaborations. It's not always enough to have one organization to implement a program or an initiative. So I thought it would be really, really helpful to share an example where there are a number of groups that are collaborating. And this is a real life example. There is an organization here in Chicago called After School Matters. And then there's another local office of LISC, and they have a new communities program, and they've worked with a number of organizations that have new communities programs as well as after school programs. And this is an example of how they propose to collaborate. So I thought that might be useful. And then, if you're interested, I thought it might be helpful. You don't necessarily have to, but I thought it would be very helpful if you wanted to do an even deeper dive is to go to our webinar where you can find out the 23 questions. Actually, there are more than 23 questions that you should answer before starting any nonprofit initiative. This will help you really flesh out some of your ideas in preparation for your needs assessment. And the needs assessment actually should be done prior to any strategic planning process, prior to any program design, prior to any theory of change, prior to the logic models that we're going to be talking about. So in your leisure, if there's such a thing as leisure, especially when you're in nonprofit management, you can download those and you can apply them to your situation. So without further ado, we're going to go into our our webinar. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in our chat room. here on the right of the screen. If you have questions, you can also ask them here in the Ask a Question tab. And if you feel so moved to join Nonprofit Utopia, you can do so here. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about making sense of program logic models. And before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about Nonprofit Utopia. We are the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. And emerging could be people who are changing careers, it could be people who are new to their position, it could be younger professionals. And we wanted to create a safe environment for an exchange of ideas. Ideally, people who are more seasoned would be sharing their ideas and their experiences with younger people, and younger people would be sharing some of the knowledge that they have gained from new approaches with those of us who are more seasoned. So we wanted to create a safe space in which that could happen. And we also wanted to prepare lots of content to help you in your journey. So our mission is to develop the next wave of emerging nonprofit leaders. People in my generation are in the baby boom, and we are retiring, and there's this leadership void if we're not careful that will be not only in the nonprofit sector but the for-profit sector. But we're going to focus on the nonprofit sector, and we want to make sure that we give you the tools that you need in order to develop, so you can develop not only your own leadership and management potential, but to also develop your organizations and bring them to a point where they are sustainable. And we also do that by providing professional development opportunities, networking, and webinars and classes such as these. Our vision is to strengthen the global nonprofit sector. So we're starting now to attract international people. So we have at least 2 members now from other countries, and we want to, span the globe. So ideally, we want to reach 50,000 people between now and 2033. And if you want to find out more about us, you can go to nonprofitutopia.com, or you can go to our community landing page at nonprofitutopia.mn.co. So to give you a little bit of information about myself, my name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I've been in this business since about 1992. And when I say this business, I'm talking about working with nonprofit organizations. So I have worked for nonprofits, and I have been consulting. I've been consulting in earnest since about 2003. And over the course of the years, I've helped over 750 organizations. And that's just in a general capacity building area. And then I've also helped to raise over $100 million in grants and contracts. So that's federal funding, state funding, public funding with the city, as well as and when I say the city, I'm talking about the city of Chicago, as well as private foundation funding. I'm also on staff at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, and I teach nonprofit management courses. The most recent has been operations management. And I also teach on faculty at Roosevelt University. I teach a social ventures course where I help our participants or our students to actually launch new businesses. So enough about me. I just wanted to let you know that I have found over the years that all too often, in many cases, the last thing we think about is a program logic model. We don't think about program logic models until we're under pressure trying to do a grant application. And truth be told, we know that that's not the ideal time to be thinking about your program structure and and how it relates to the community. So I wanted to create this course to help you to really think things through, during a time where you're not so focused on meeting a grant deadline, but to actually think things through. So in an ideal sense, the program logic model should be done after you've done a strategic plan, and the strategic plan should be done after you've done a community needs assessment, and also after you do your theory of change. Unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And if you're anything like me, you do these things when you can. And we're just going to catch up and do what they say, get in where you fit in, right? So we have a lot to cover, and we basically want to build upon a theory of change to show how that translates into a program logic model. And then next week, we'll focus on building out your logic model to have a full-fledged program. All right, so without further ado, we will have 30 to 45 minutes of class instruction. We'll give you an opportunity as you go. You can type in questions either in our chat room here below or in the Ask a Question segment. If you feel moved, if you want to come out and join me on the screen with your questions, with your comments, sharing some of your experiences, you can do that. You will also get a recording of this event, and you'll have access to the resources in our chat room. And members of Nonprofit Utopia will get to meet. Next week, we'll have office hours. We're doing this during our regular office hour time, and we'll be able to take a deeper dive where we can look at your individual logic models, get some feedback from other group members. I'll give you feedback as well. So just by review, a community needs assessment, it's a way of really assessing, what's going on in the community. And depending on what the purpose is, you can gauge opinions, you can develop assumptions, you can better understand key issues, and that's for people who are doing political work or issue advocacy. And you can also assess what the community has in terms of assets so you can move forward. And ideally, your community needs assessment is going to actually inform your logic model so you can develop a program that's responsive to the issues and to the needs of your particular client, of your particular community. And when we do a community needs assessment, it can be used for a number of different purposes. Obviously, we want to develop new programs, new services. We want to improve the programs. We want to develop proposals. But they can also be used to give you a snapshot of what's going on. And you really need to do this consistently because our environments are full of change. We are using your community needs assessment, obviously, to identify community needs and concerns and issues. They can also be used to develop marketing strategies and galvanize grassroots support around actions that we need to address the issues of our clients and communities. We can use them to determine the extent to which the community needs have changed over time, and we can collect our community stories, their hopes and dreams and desires over time. But most importantly, we want to make sure that we're responsive at all times to our constituents in our communities. So there are a number of tools that we can use to develop our final product. And another name for these community needs assessment tools is research methods. So one method or one tool is surveys and questionnaires, where you can get a sense for what people's attitudes are. And you can also collect numeric data, if you do scaled questions. and you can collect qualitative data to, get more of a to get deeper responses. And your interviews go even deeper. They could be one-on-one interviews, talking with people about what's going on in the community, about specific services in the community, so that you can better position your programs and services to what they need. Another way of gleaning information, and ideally you want to use as many of these tools as possible so you can get a complete picture. So another way we can do is collect the data is to look at what other people have already done. Look at what the literature says. And this could be scholarly research. It could be research that was done by other organizations that are doing similar things, so that you can get a better understanding for what models could potentially work and what doesn't work, and learn from others' experiences. Another way to glean information is through asset mapping. And when we look at asset mapping can be done in a literal sense, where we're looking at where key organizations are located within a community and the types of resources they might have. Or we might do it in a figurative sense, where we're looking at diagrams to really better understand the relationships between the assets and our particular organization and our particular needs. We can also do focus group discussions, and those are basically group interviews. And when we do the focus group discussions, ideally we want to pick people to participate who very, very closely mirror our various constituent groups. We might want to get people who represent our clients. We might want to get people who represent our board, people who represent management groups. So, depending on what the purpose of the organizational assessment, the program, or initiative, that will determine who is in your focus group. And another way to glean information and public support at the same time, as well as gauge whether there could be any opposition, is to hold public meetings and get a sense for what people are thinking. You want to share your ideas. And in an ideal sense, you want those public meetings to be an opportunity where there is some back and forth between what you want to do and what you're saying, and what the community needs. Your community meeting should never be one way, where you're informing people of what you've done without giving people an opportunity to ask questions, without giving people an opportunity to respond, without giving people the opportunity to tell you what they think and what they need. And when you pull all of that information together, then you have a much, much better idea of what the community needs. You have a much better idea of how you're going to approach the community in terms of your programs and your services and any other initiative that you plan to do. So when we assess the community, our next step, and again, this is in an ideal situation, and we almost never work in ideal situations, but ideally your next step is going to be to develop a theory of change. And a theory of change basically describes the progress of planned social change, and it includes the assumptions that guide its design to the long-term goals that it seeks to achieve. So it can be depicted in a map, and we do have a link to a flow chart that gives you, a really good example of what a theory of change could look like, and some of the questions that you might want to ask along the way. And it also helps to establish a blueprint for the work that's ahead. And it helps you to, make assumptions, gather the data, so that you can anticipate not only changes, but what those changes could have in store for you as your organization, for your clients and communities. And your theory of change also reveals what should be evaluated, when and how, and what data will be collected. And here is a much simpler diagram. What we have a link to in your chat room is much more detailed. But the theory of change, it really assumes that you have already done the work of doing your community needs assessment. So after you do your community needs assessment, you want to evaluate your mission in terms of what's going on in the community. If you are a startup, you would actually craft your mission to reflect what's going on in the community. If you are an ongoing organization or institution, you may end up at a point where you're deciding, do we want to keep our mission the same based on this information that we gathered from the community? Or do we want to make changes to our mission? Do we want to just scrap it all together and have a new mission? So once you understand your mission, understand what's going on in the environment, you're not going to have complete information. So at that point, you're going to have to make some assumptions and get a sense for what it is in that environment that makes you feel one way or the other about your approach to your services. And then you want to also decide who your target is going to be. You could have a segment, have your target segmented by age or different characteristics, or you can just focus on a single target. But you want to be as specific as possible because you want to make sure that your programs are as impactful as possible. So once you know who your target is, then you can begin to develop strategies and programs that will move them from where they are to a point of, I don't want to say wholeness, but it moves them closer to what I would call self-actualization. And people are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we, at a very basic level, we focus on human needs at a very basic level with a goal of moving up higher and higher, where we have met all of those needs, and then we begin to contribute to society. So we want to be able to move our clients from a point of those very basic needs, things like food, food and clothing, to getting them to a point where they can take advantage of what the program has offered them and share it, and they can begin to empower others. And then once we develop those strategies and programs, we want to reflect upon the lessons learned. We want to look at what's worked, what didn't work so well, and we want to share the outcomes. And based on that information, we go full circle and we revisit our mission. Again, determining whether or not the mission itself stays, whether or not it needs to be tweaked, whether or not we need to change it and approach the market differently. And that varies based on where you are, who you serve, and what changes are in the community. So we use our situation analysis we use our community needs assessment to develop our situation analysis. And basically the situation analysis is a snapshot of what's going on in the community. It helps provide the backdrop or the context within which you're developing your programs and your program logic model. You can focus on issues at the macro level, drilling down to the micro level, which could include your own organization and your clients. It'll talk about the major players, the latest developments and issues, and the implications and the impact to your clients and community. So in short, a program logic model, it looks at the environment, and then based on what's going on in the environment, it helps to develop a set of goals and objectives and approaches to your clients, right? It's going to outline the resources that you need to operate the program. So that could be human resources, financial resources. It's going to outline the activities in which you engage. It's going to talk about the desired change that you want to see in your clients and in your communities. And they could be just as simple as these little three boxes, which will be the inputs and the outputs and the outcomes. And the inputs are basically those resources. Outputs are those activities in which you're going to engage. And the outcomes are the change that you would like to see. So it could be just as simple as that, or it could be very, very, very complex and look like a flow chart to a computer diagram. And that's not why we're here today. We want to make this as simple as possible, but we want to make sure it's as thorough as possible so that your programs are designed in such a way that over time they can become evidence-based. So you're going to model the science in developing your program, and then over time you will have the evidence to show that your program does in fact work. So we can use program logic models. And again, if you have any questions as I talk, you can type in the chat room, or you can ask a question in the Ask the Question tab. So we're going to show you how you can use the logic model in 3 places. Ideally, you want to use your program logic model in the planning phase. You want to use your program logic model in the implementation phase, so when your program is up and running. And you want to use your program logic model during your evaluation phase. And ideally, it's going to be the same model, and you'll tweak it as you go. This way, you're not in a position where you're scrambling on the back end trying to figure out what to evaluate and what data to collect. So when we use our program logic models on the planning side, we're looking at our problem statement, we're looking at the issues that we might find in our clients, in our community. And then we also, again, as I said before, we want to focus on the community needs assessment. So you will have gone through that rigorous process of really understanding what the needs are. And in an ideal sense, you don't want to focus on needs and deficits, but you want to focus on what's already in the client, right? What qualities they already have. You want to focus on the community assets that will help move them from where they are to a higher point towards self-actualization. And then at this stage 2, you want to look at the outputs, you want to look at the activities, you want to look at the outcomes and the impacts, so over time. You want to also look at influential factors. And when we talk about influential factors, those could be positive or negative. So what is it in the environment? And these are usually things that we have no control over. So what's going on in the environment that we have no control over that's going to impact our clients and our ability to serve them, right? So this could be things like changes in the laws that could impact us for the positive, or it could have a negative impact. And then at that point, we got to figure out, how we want to respond in such a way that we mitigate that impact, right? And then once we get a sense for what's going on that could make this environment favorable and give us confidence that we're on the right track, then we determine the strategies and the programs. And we can do that by looking at best practices for other models that we've seen across the country or in similar neighborhoods, or we can use our own data. Sometimes the data that we collect with our own experience with our own clients and our own communities can give us a certain, I would say, a certain advantage and a certain knowledge that others don't have, and helps us get the insight where we can develop programs that are even more closely targeted and more relevant. And it'll also help ground our assumptions. So at that point, we will have the information at our fingertips that help us support the assumptions that we make in the absence of perfect data. So there's no such thing as a perfect data set, but we want to get as much information as possible so that we can make educated hunches about how we should proceed. So, in summary, we want to start with a problem or an issue in the community, and then we want to address community needs. And ideally, we want to identify those assets that will address those needs. And again, we don't want to focus on deficits, but we really want to focus on what we have at our fingertips. What qualities our clients have, what institutions are in the community that can help us, what organizations in the community that can help us, what city agencies can help us. So what needs um, can be addressed based on what's already out there. We can look at step 3, and those will be our desired results. So what are we producing in this case as a result of the problems that we have and the assets that we have that can help us solve those problems? What outcomes do we want to achieve? What's going to be the short-term impact? What's the magnitude of that impact? And what's going to be the long-term impact? And then number 4, what are those influential factors that are going to either help us move closer to where we want to be in terms of the impact and the outcomes, or what are those influential factors that could prove to be challenging, and how are we going to address those challenges? And then what will our strategies be, and what assumptions have we made that will undergird those strategies that make us feel confident that we're proceeding in the right direction? So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type. So when we look at our logic models in the implementation phase, we want to look at the activities, we want to look at the resources. So what activities are you going to engage in? Are you going to have workshops? Are you going to have classes? Are you going to have intake, registration types of activities? So think about what this process is going to look like from beginning to end. And you don't necessarily have to chart every activity, but you want to be able to understand the flow of those activities that are going to have the most impact. And in some programs, intake might not be as important as others, but when you're dealing with programs such as an educational program or a program that you're working with ex-offenders, your intake process is extremely, extremely important, because at that point you are developing a profile of what your participants look like. You are developing a baseline of where they are, and you're going to be able to use the data that you collect in that process to determine, during the implementation phase as well as during your evaluation phase, as to whether or not your program is working structurally, or is it working from an outcome standpoint. You want to also describe the resources that you're going to need in terms of human resources, in terms of financial resources. And then again, you want to look at those influential factors. So in this case, your influential factors, again, could be some new legislation coming down the pipe that is going to impact the way you do your work, or it could be sunsetting of legislation that again could impact your work. Legislation, as we know, could impact funding. It could impact the demand, which will ultimately impact funding. So we need to be aware of all of the resources and all of the factors to the extent possible that could impact our work and our ability to serve our clients. We also, given those resources that we need, given those inputs that we need, we want to begin to outline what is it that we're producing, right? You want to also outline what is going to be the result of all of this activity and these products that we're producing, these services that we're providing, and then you want to look at the impact. What's going to change as a result in the short term, in the long term? Um, and hopefully that change will be sustainable. So in summary, our program logic model can look similar to this diagram. Ideally, we would start with the situation analysis, then we'll look at the resources, the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, and then the impact. And a third place we can use our program logic models is during the evaluation process. So you're going to develop your logic model again in such a way that you take into account the data that you're going to have to collect, the intervals at which you collected, and who's involved. So when you review your logic model during the evaluation phase, it makes it much, much, much easier to determine, one, is this program working? Is it working from an operational standpoint, meaning the nuts and bolts are operating pretty smoothly. There are very few kinks and glitches in the process. Is it having the intended outcome that we said that we would have? So we look at our focus area. So from your program theory logic model, which you have a link to, right? You want to list the components that are most important, because some programs we know can be really, really complex, especially if you're working with Second Chance Act. But you want to focus on those things that can make the biggest impact and those things over which your particular organization has the most control, and those things, quite honestly, that your funder cares about. So if you can get that intersection between what's good for your client, what's good for the organization, what's good for the funder, that's where you have your sweet spot in terms of the focus of your program evaluation. You need to also determine, who the audience is. And as you know, your audience for your evaluation is going to change. Obviously, your audience is going to include people who work with the programs, but they're not your primary target. But your people, your staff, as well as your management team, they need to be acutely aware of the results so that they can improve the programs. Your board needs to be aware so that they can exercise their fiduciary responsibility. They have oversight over everything that the organization does. Your funder cares, right, about the outcomes of the evaluation. Your potential partners care, especially if they were partnering with you in this process. But you can use evaluation results to attract new partners. You can use your evaluation results to engage the community and to let your community know the impact of the work that you're doing. So your evaluation process is critical, And it can, again, inform your work, but it also can be used for multiple purposes. You can use it for marketing purposes, for messaging and PR purposes. And for each focus area and audience, you got a list of questions that they may have. So again, just like you're doing market segmentation when you're developing your program, as you design your evaluation process, you need to think about what audiences are going to care about what pieces of information. And in an ideal sense, if you keep doing the evaluations, keep sharing summaries of your results, you begin to position your organization as a thought leader on issues that pertain to your particular community. So if you're dealing with ex-offenders, you keep doing these evaluations and sharing the results, your organization becomes the go-to on those issues. If you're dealing with housing and you're doing evaluation, you keep doing evaluations and sharing the results, not only with your funders, but with potential partners, then you become the go-to entity in that particular segment. And then, so we already talked about how this is going to be used in terms of information, but the indicators are really important. So that's looking at the data that you're going to be collecting and what measurements you're going to be using. And that is going to vary based on what subsector of the nonprofit community you're working with. So your indicators for housing, if you're a housing developer, could be things like the number of units of housing that you produce, or the number of people going through your affordable housing ownership program and that thing. If you are working with ex-offenders, obviously one indicator would be the number of people who are registered, but it can also look at things like the number of that number of people, how many have actually gotten jobs, how many keep jobs, or after 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. And you can also use this process as a way to assess how much technical assistance you need, if you need it, or whether or not you can actually do the evaluation yourself and keep everything in-house, or whether or not you hire an evaluator. And there are a number of reasons why you would want to do the evaluation in-house versus doing an outside evaluation. If you were to do in-house evaluations, obviously that's a much quicker process, but it may not necessarily be as objective. If you do it in-house, ideally you want to have someone who is not actually administering the program doing the evaluation. Maybe someone from your board, or there are some organizations are large enough where they have people, all they do is focus on program evaluation and data collection. But if you're not fortunate enough to be in that situation where you have to do everything in-house, then it would probably be helpful to have someone on the board do it, and be able to obviously help that board member understand the process. So that board member may need to go through some training to better understand evaluation. It is helpful and probably more advantageous to have someone from the outside do your evaluation if you can afford it. One, that outside evaluator does not have a horse in the race, is not vested in the outcome. It has a greater appearance of independence, and people will be more likely, and when I say people, I think funders might be more likely to see that as an objective review of your process. So in that instance, it's more advantageous, but it's also more expensive. So depending on where you are, what your purpose for an evaluation is. If your purpose is just to get a quick and dirty assessment as to how you can improve a program, then you don't necessarily need an outside evaluator. But if you're working toward having your model be recognized nationally as an evidence-based model, you have to have an outside evaluator who is going to structure the evaluation in such a way that the criteria are more rigorous for evaluation, and it'll be more scientific, and there'll be stronger evidence. But if your goal is just to make sure that the program operates efficiently, if your goal is just to make sure that you meet your outcomes, then that's sufficient. You don't necessarily need that academic or scientific rigor. So at this point, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a goal is, but I thought it would be good to include the goals, because as simple as goals are, that's one of the areas where we tend to split hairs. And I think it's also very useful to have your goals actually on the program logic models. Again, there's some program logic models that are so simple that they don't necessarily talk about situation analysis or the goals and objectives. But I think your stronger models actually do focus on the goals, and quite simply, that's the end toward which the program is directed. And you want to make sure that your goals and objectives are in alignment with the overall mission of the organization. And you want to make sure that they're measurable, that they're smart, right? For example, there will be a 5% decrease in the number of freshmen who drop out of high school within the first year of the after-school program. So this demonstrates impact, right? It tells you what's going to happen. It tells you who it's going to happen to. It tells you when it's going to happen, and it's relatively reasonable, right? And then the same goes for objectives. Ideally, you want smart objectives too. And when we say smart, those are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, and achievable is different based on your capacity. So achievable is different things for different organizations. A $5 million organization is going to have a different level of what's achievable than a startup. You want something, you want your goals and objectives to be reasonable and timely. So you want a deadline. And ideally, you want to have those short-term goals, mid-term goals, and long-term goals. So in this case, we can have objectives, they could be outcome objectives, and they can be process objectives. And basically, objectives are just a way to meet your goals. Your goals tell you what you aspire to, and your objectives are telling you how you're going to get there. So in this case, outcome objectives are those measurable, time-specific results that the organization expects to accomplish during the planning horizon. So, and also this could be during your implementation horizon, depending on what the specific outcome objective is. So, for example, there will be a 5% decrease in the number of frail older adults going into convalescent homes during the first year of the social services referral program. So, not only does this demonstrate impact and result, but it also talks about how you're going to do it. So, you want to decrease the number of, how you're going to meet your goal of I'm sorry, and let me go back to the goal here. So in this case, there's going to be a 5% decrease in the number of freshmen who drop out of high school within the first year of this program. We can talk about the fact that we want our overall goal for elderly is to make sure that they can age in place. So if the overall goal is for them to age in place, one way to do that is to make sure that we decrease the number of frail older adults going into convalescent homes. So you want to make sure that you provide them the resources that they need. So those would be other outcome objectives. And I'm sorry, those would be process objectives because that goes to the that goes to the nuts and bolts. The process objectives, again, those are the nuts and bolts, and they quantify a method for achieving the goal. And in this example, there will be an increase in social services referrals and follow-up for 75% of the individuals served by the Mills Consortium between 2000 and 2001. So this tells you how by talking about a process. So the outcome objective is telling you how it's going to change and when it's going to change and the magnitude of the change. And the process objective is telling you how many people are going to actually be impacted. So when we look at the key indicators, that's just another way of saying the measurement units. Those are the units that we use to help us determine how close we're getting to meeting those goals, how close we're getting to meeting our process objectives, our outcome objectives. So for example, the number of frail adults or the number of referrals. So if our objective is to serve 100, then the number of referrals is going to be, if you want to do, if we want to serve 100 people, right, but we want to make, say, 400 referrals because they might need several referrals, then we can look at the number of referrals and see how close we are to getting them. Did we meet our mark, or did we not meet our mark? And the way you know it is to collect those data. And you really, really need to focus on developing your programs in such a way that the data collection process is embedded in the program. You don't want to necessarily feel like the data collection is separate and apart from the program, because one, that's more work and it feels like drudgery. So if you can design your forms, your intake forms in such a way as you're collecting baseline data, if you can design your program materials such that you're collecting and entering those data over time as part of your day-to-day activities, it doesn't feel so much like work on the back end when you're doing your evaluation. So we talked about the process. We want to now talk about a prisoner reentry example. So when we look at the needs assessment, we want to look at things like how many offenders are returning to the community on a weekly basis, who's impacted by their return. We want to, look at some of the problems they encounter and the resources that they need in order to successfully transition. And when I say transition, I'm talking about transition back into society. We also want to, as a part of this community needs assessment, we want to scan the environment. So we want to see who else is out there. What services do they have? What institutions are providing these services? What organizations, what individuals are providing these services? Do the services work? If so, how well? Are there gaps in programs? Is there duplication? And even if there is duplication, is there still unmet capacity? And then are there gaps? Where does your organization fit in? How can you address those gaps? So after you look at what's going on, then you want to, basically do what we call a situation analysis. So you're looking at the big picture. So that could be, what's going on at the national level. It could be what's going on with policy, what's going on with new laws. At the micro level, we might look at what's going on either at the state level, at the county level, or the city level. We want to drill down to our own service areas, our own community, our own organizations, and our own clients. And then once we understand, what's happening in the community, and what this current situation is, we want to develop goals and objectives. And based on the goals and objectives and what we know about our situation, we begin to look at the inputs. So this model that I like to use, this is my favorite logic model, and this is adapted from the University of Wisconsin, their extension program action model. And this is actually probably one of the most common models in the country. So we look at what we invest. So we look at the things that we already have, the resources that we already have, things like money, time for my staff, our equipment and supplies. And then we look at those things that we need also, things that we don't have but we need in order to meet those goals and objectives. So those are things that we might acquire. So we might have to hire more people. We might have to get additional training. And then we determine who our target is. That would be our target community. It would be our target clients within that community. And then we determine what it is that we're going to do. Are we going to do programs? Are we going to do services? And then we look at the outcomes that we want to achieve. So how will the community change, for the better, hopefully, as a result of what we do? How will our clients be impacted for the better as a result of what we do? And you want to look at this on a short-term basis, on a long-term basis, and somewhere in between. And just so we are clear on what a program is versus what a service is, a program we know is done for the best interest of our clients and community, but we don't really have any intentionality to measure things like impact. Whereas a program, there's an intentionality, there are specific goals, specific outcomes, activities. We're looking for change. And the example I like to use is, what's the difference between a soup kitchen and say a diet? The diet, basically, there's an intentionality. You want to eat certain foods in order to change your health status. You might want to lose weight. You might want to control your blood sugar. You might want to control your blood pressure. And then you measure that. You look at things that you eat over time. You record what you eat. You record what your measurements are. If you exercise, you record what exercise you did. And those things, diet, exercise, would be your interventions. And then over time, we would hope that things like weight would be positively impacted. So we would hope that we would lose weight. That would be one of your desired outcomes. We would hope that your blood pressure would be better controlled and all that good stuff. So once you understand, whether or not you want to do programs or services or a combination thereof, and once you know what your outcomes are, then you're ready to set yourself up for a good evaluation process. Again, that's why I really, really like this model, because not only are you looking at inputs, outputs, and outcomes, but you're looking at your situation, you're looking at goals and objectives, and you're looking at all of the activities in developing your program and you're laying the groundwork for ongoing evaluation. So I'm going to take this full screen because this writing is very small. So this is a sample mentoring program logic model, and this is based on one of the programs under the Second Chance Act. So this is based on the mentoring section, and this is actually based on one of the federal proposals that came out a few years ago. So the overall goal for this particular program was to reduce the rate of recidivism among clients in the Second Chance Act funded programs by 50% over the next 5 years. And notice the way this goal is written. It's not trying to reduce the rate of recidivism in the whole service area, because you really don't have control over what's going on in the whole service area, but you do have a little bit more control, a little bit more influence over the people that you're serving who have actually enrolled in your program. So that goal is developed after looking at the situation analysis. So at the time this was written, over 650,000 inmates were released every year in the United States, and they returned to their families and community. We also knew at that time, without intervention, 40% of the returning inmates would return to prison within 5 years. So that's a pretty high level of recidivism. And we also knew at that time that over 18,000 inmates were released into Cook County, and 15,000, or 84%, were released to the city of Chicago. And it wasn't enough room to put that here, but there's 6 zip codes that accounted for the majority of those 15,000. And we also knew that the Second Chance Act of 2007 was passed in 2008. So you notice that we had macro information where we focused on what was going on nationally. We focused on what was going on in Cook County, but we also we didn't do it on this particular slide, but when I worked with the client, we also drilled down to what was going on in their particular community so that we could put everything into context. And given that situation, then we developed the goals. We also looked at the inputs, and the inputs would be things like hiring a case manager, recruiting and training mentors, hiring a VISTA volunteer. So those are things in this case that we had to acquire. We also had to purchase software to track program outcomes. And we wanted to provide professional development opportunities and training for staff, develop pre-release orientation and learning opportunities for prisoners. And depending on who you are, you might already do that in-house, or you might have to go out and acquire that. And we also wanted to provide matching funds and in-kind donations of up to 50% of the grant amount. So some of the outputs were, and those are the activities in which we were engaged. We want to target nonviolent offenders 18 years or older that have been released from prison within the past 180 days. We wanted to provide case management and mentoring programs. We wanted to provide job training and placement programs. So these are activities. We wanted to make referrals to supportive services. And notice too, especially if you're familiar with how the Second Chance Act works, and if you're familiar with their grants, we wrote this in such a way that it was in alignment with what the government was trying to achieve. So we wanted to make sure that our programs are not outside the boundaries of what was, uh, what the funder was looking for. But at the same time, we wanted to make sure it was not outside the boundaries of what we could provide. But since this was going into a grant application, we wanted to keep the language as close to what the funder was looking for as possible so it wouldn't look foreign to them or foreign to the reviewers. We also looked at the outcomes and made sure that the outcomes were in alignment with what the funder was looking for. So in this case, an outcome was our clients were to secure employment, and an indicator, that would help us understand how close we were would be the number of clients entering employment. We wanted to make sure that our clients established consistent work histories, and an indicator of that, and the data that we wanted to track would be the number of clients remaining employed. And we did that in stages after 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and then a year. We wanted to make sure as an outcome that clients earn living wages, and an indicator of whether or not they were earning living wages were their average earnings. And then another outcome was to increase public safety. And an indicator of that would be the rates of recidivism among program participants. Notice again, program participants and not recidivism amongst the community, because you have no control or even influence in some cases as to what happens with returning prisoners in the community. You only have control over the people who go through your program. And I use the word control limit, loosely. So the evaluation process, how are we going to know that we're successful? So in this case, we develop an overall guiding question. What is the power of mentorship to reduce recidivism? And ideally, if in fact the mentorship model is effective, we should see a lower rate of recidivism amongst people who participate in our program than we would see at the national level, than what we would see at the state level, and even in our particular community, right? So you want to make sure that you develop your intake process in such a way that you can glean data that can then begin to be used for your evaluation process. You want to identify who is going to be responsible for collecting those data and at what point they're going to be collecting them. And it will behoove you to do some informal assessment before the year is out, after 2 or 3 months, just to make sure that your program is working properly. You might have to make adjustments. You might see that you're not meeting certain targets in terms of production or in terms of outcome. You can use that first 2 to 3 months to better understand why. It could be a problem with your design, or it could be a problem with, your partners, or, other factors beyond your control. But at any rate, once you understand why you're not meeting your targets, you can make an adjustment. And then a year out, you can actually do a bona fide assessment or an evaluation. So again, you have to decide whether or not you want to do this in-house or whether or not you want to hire someone. If your goal is to develop programs that eventually become national models of evidence-based programs, then you need to get an experienced evaluator who can evaluate your program and document the results in such a way that it's pretty clear that, that there's causality. You can definitely trace the results to being a result of the outcomes to being a result of your interventions. And I don't know, some of you who are working with Second Chance Act, you probably already know that logic models can also be used for collaborations, but there may be some of you who are on this call who don't necessarily understand how to create logic models for collaboration. So I include an example of collaboration in the next slide. And basically, before you do that, you need to understand the roles that each person is going to have, the roles that each organization is going to have. You need systems of accountability. You need to have the program and collaborative structure. You need to understand the activities and resources that you'll need. So this is a real example of a truancy program logic model. This was put together, I did this for a client who was very interested in understanding how After School Matters and the New Communities program could come together and do program in a manner that is seamless. So for those of you who are not from Chicago, After School Matters is it's an organization that provides after-school programming in several neighborhoods around the city of Chicago. And the New Communities program is sponsored by Chicago LISC. And the New Communities program is basically a program that enables local community groups to do their own community planning. And there was overlap between After School Matters programming and New Communities programming. And the two collaborations were looking at ways they could come together and align their work in a way that was more impactful. So they analyzed the situation, and I'm not going to go through every line in this because I do believe there's an example. So they analyzed the situation of what was happening at the national level and what was going on with some of the communities in which they worked. So they noticed that 83% of CPS students were reading below national averages, and this was more than 10 years ago. So that's not the case now, but this was the situation then. At that time, Chicago had over 47,000 truants per year, and 70% of American students graduated by age 19 versus only 55% of Chicago students back in that time. And we also noticed that the average high school dropout earned at that time about $17,500 per year versus $52,000 for college graduates. And we also noticed that high school dropouts were at a greater risk for going to prison. So given what was going on in the situation, we developed overall goals, which was to utilize after-school programming to support Chicago Public Schools' efforts to improve student performance, reduce the instance of truancy within the neighborhoods that these organizations served, reduce the dropout rate for high school students in those local communities that they served, and to increase the graduation rates for high school students in those communities. So basically we did a logic model. We looked at, who did what, and we just did a logic model that would reflect the activities of all of these organizations. So as a collective, what did they have already that they were willing to contribute in terms of resources? What resources did they need to, that they didn't already have at their fingertips? And what kinds of activities were they going to be involved in? So we looked at the outputs column. So we wanted to make sure that they were developing program models that can be replicated throughout after school matters and the NCP communities. They wanted to engage in participatory research. They wanted to provide technical assistance. They wanted to convene community stakeholders and conduct ongoing quality control. And they had several targets that included youth, parents, community stakeholders, key decision makers, intermediaries, and funders. So you would approach those different targets different ways, but everybody was interested in making sure that the kids improve their uh, graduation rates as well as attendance. So we looked at the outcomes and the impact. Short term, we wanted to see better attendance and better performance and increase opportunities. And then we wanted to make sure that over time, our kids were doing just as well as better than students were at the national level in terms of performance and attendance and graduation rates. And then we wanted to reduce delinquency and enhance their work prospects. So in this case, we developed a sample evaluation question. What's the effectiveness of utilizing after-school programming to increase high school performance and retention in the community served by these three groups? And again, you have an example of this, you have a link to this in the chat room. So at this point, we want to talk about what's next. And if you are a member of the nonprofit Utopia community, we're going to have office hours next Thursday, October 31st at 10 a.m., where we can talk about your particular logic model and give you input as to what we think can improve. And hopefully there'll be other members on the call as well that will give you some insights and share activities and share some of their experiences. So that will happen again next Thursday on the 31st. So if you have any questions about this webinar, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard@nonprofitutopia.com. And Nonprofit Utopia members, you are able to post this in our forum. And if you want to follow us, you can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter as well as Facebook. All right, so this basically concludes the lecture portion. If you have any questions about what you've heard, if you have any questions about how you might proceed in your own process, let me know. You can chat right now. We have the chat room open. We have the ask a question section open, and you can feel free to share any comments or ask any questions. So I will wait a few minutes for you to type, and if I don't see any questions, I will assume that we have covered everything that you need to know. Again, I want to point your attention to all the resources that we have in our chat room. I think these are pretty self-explanatory, but if you have any questions, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard@nonprofitutopia.com. Okay. All righty, so I don't see any questions. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. I had a really good time. I hope you had a good time. I hope this was helpful to you. Next week, when we talk about designing programs, we're going to show you the relationship between the theory of change, the program logic model, and how these can be built up so that you can expand and create a full-blown program with goals and objectives, with a budget, and show you the relationship between the activities and budget and all that good stuff. All right, so without further ado, I am going to sign off now. I don't see any questions, and I just want to say thank you so much for attending. I will talk to you next week, and those of you who are members, please make sure you join us for office hours next week. Those of you who are not members, please feel free to email me. All right. So you guys take care. Bye bye.